Welcome to Spooken Softly, where darkness breathes and shadows whisper. I'm your host, and tonight we venture somewhere you may not return from unchanged. Find a quiet place, turn down the lights, and let the story find you. Tonight's episode, Snow Globes. The rental cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that clung to the bruised shoulder of the mountain. It was surrounded by black pines that seemed to crowd the gravel drive, their long, needle-heavy branches scraping against the roof of our station wagon as we pulled in. It was meant to be a healing trip, a quiet week to patch over the widening fractures in our family. 2 years ago, we lost my sister to a sudden, cruel illness, and I had spent every day since then wrapped in a heavy, paralysing guilt for not visiting her more. I became obsessive, clinging to my husband Mark and our 2 boys, Leo and Toby, with a desperate, choking grip. This vacation was my attempt to let them breathe, to show them I could be whole again. But as the engine sputtered and died, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was not peaceful. It was heavy, wet, and ancient. The cabin itself was beautiful in a cold, sterile way. Inside, the pine floorboards groaned under our weight, releasing a sharp, antiseptic scent of lemon wax and dry rot. My heels clicked too loudly in the vaulted living room, the sound bouncing off the bare log walls. But it wasn't the high ceilings or the sweeping views of the misty valley that drew our eyes. It was the wall. Built into the far side of the room was a massive floor-to-ceiling shelving unit of dark, almost black mahogany. On its shelves sat hundreds of snow globes. There were easily 400 of them, arranged in flawless geometric rows. Each one contained a tiny, meticulously detailed world: the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, Mount Everest, even obscure desert ruins and frozen Arctic outposts. Under each globe was a neat, tight label indicating the location, and hung directly in front of the shelves, suspended by thin brass chains, were 3 identical, heavy wooden signs. Painted in thick, aggressive red letters, they read, "Do not, under any circumstance, touch the snow globes." I stared at the signs, a cold prickle of unease sliding down my spine. The listing online had mentioned them, of course, with a stern warning from the host, but seeing them in person, hanging like barricades, felt different. It felt like a threat.
Well, that's not ominous at all,
Mark murmured, throwing our duffel bags onto the floor with a heavy thud.
Looks like the owner is a bit of a fanatic. Boys, you heard the signs. Hands to yourselves.
Leo, who was 12 and perpetually bored, barely glanced up from his phone. Toby, our gentle 10-year-old, shrank back slightly, his eyes wide as they reflected the glass dome of a globe containing a miniature, snow-dusted cathedral.
Why can't we touch them, Dad? Are they worth a lot of money?
Probably. Some collectors are crazy about these things. Just leave them be. Now, let's get settled.
We had been driving for nearly 9 hours. The exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on my temples. We set the boys up in front of the television, plugging in their game console to keep them occupied, hoping to catch just an hour of deep, dreamless sleep before we had to drive into the valley for dinner. As I closed the bedroom door, the light from the living room was swallowed by the heavy timber of the cabin. I climbed into the king-sized bed next to Mark, pulling the stiff wool blanket to my chin. I expected my thoughts to keep me awake, to replay the guilt of my sister's final weeks. But instead, a profound, unnatural fatigue washed over me. It felt less like falling asleep and more like being dragged underwater. The last sound I heard before slipping into the dark was the faint, rhythmic scratching of pine needles against the bedroom window. I woke to a sound that shattered the heavy silence of the cabin. It wasn't a cry or a whimper. It was a raw, lung-tearing shriek of pure terror. "Toby!" I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Next to me, Mark was already scrambling out of bed, his face pale in the dim, grey light of the late afternoon. We threw the bedroom door open and ran into the living room. Toby was standing in the centre of the room, his knees shaking so violently he looked as though he might collapse. His hands were clasped over his mouth, his chest heaving. Leo's game controller lay on the rug, the television screen humming with a static blue light. But Leo was not there.
He's gone. He's gone. He touched it, Mom. He touched it and he went inside.
Toby, calm down, sweetie. Where is your brother? Did he go outside? Did he go to the bathroom?
No! He touched the globe. The one with the snowy forest. There was a weird sound, like wind blowing inside the room, and then he was just gone. He's in the glass, Mom. I saw him.
Mark took Toby by the shoulders, his voice strained but trying to maintain a veneer of parental authority.
Toby, stop. This isn't funny. Leo, get out here right now. If this is a prank, you are grounded for the rest of the summer.
There was no answer, only the low electrical hum of the television. I felt a cold dread pooling in my stomach. I ran to the front door. It was locked from the inside, the deadbolt firmly in place. I checked the kitchen, the bathrooms, the small loft upstairs. Nothing. The cabin was small, with nowhere to hide. He was simply gone. I returned to the living room, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Toby was pointing a shaking finger at the mahogany shelves.
It was that one. The one with the dark trees.
Mark strode over to the shelves, his face tight with anger and confusion. He stopped in front of a snow globe on the third shelf. It was labelled, "The Black Forest, Germany." Inside the glass dome was a dense thicket of tiny hand-painted pine trees, so dark they looked almost black. A layer of white sediment rested at the bottom.
This is ridiculous. He probably snuck out the back window. Laura, stay here with Toby. I'm going to look around the perimeter.
Mark, wait. Look at the glass. I stepped closer, my eyes straining in the dimming light of the cabin. I felt an invisible weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Inside the tiny glass dome, nestled deep within the miniature black forest, was a figure. It was incredibly small, barely the size of an ant, but it was wearing a bright blue jacket. Leo had been wearing his favourite blue hoodie. My breath hitched.
That's just the detail in the toy, Laura. It's a coincidence.
He's not outside, Mark. Look at it. Please, don't touch it. But Mark, driven by a father's desperate need to find a rational explanation, ignored me. He reached out, his hand passing directly under the hanging wooden warning sign.
I'm going to prove to you that this is just...
His fingers brushed the glass dome of the Black Forest globe. A sudden violent rush of air swept through the closed living room. It didn't blow the curtains or stir the dust, but it rumbled in my ears, a deep, pressure-altering pop that made my teeth ache. The temperature in the room plummeted in an instant, our breath forming pale plumes of mist in the sudden chill. And then, with a sound like a wet towel snapping, Mark was gone. There was no flash of light, no scream. He was simply replaced by empty air. I fell to my knees, a soundless cry tearing from my throat. Toby began to weep openly, burying his face in my side. I stared at the shelf. Beside the Black Forest globe, another globe sat quietly on its mahogany perch. This one was labelled the Sahara Dunes. Inside the glass, under a blazing yellow sun painted on the background, were rolling mounds of real sand. And there, standing atop the highest painted dune, was a tiny figure in a grey t-shirt and jeans. Mark's clothes. He was frozen, one arm raised as if to shield his eyes from a sun that didn't exist. My mind fractured. The grief and guilt I had carried for years suddenly mutated into a sharp, icy clarity. I was alone with my youngest son in a house that was a graveyard of lost souls. I looked at the hundreds of globes lining the wall. How many of them held people? How many tourists, families, and travellers had stayed in this cabin, ignored the signs, and been scattered across these tiny artificial glass worlds? "Toby," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow and distant, as if I were already speaking from deep underwater. "We have to get them back."
How? Mom, we can't touch them. We'll disappear too.
I looked at the globes. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the very bottom shelf, partially hidden by a decorative wooden moulding, was a globe that was completely empty. It had no miniature trees, no painted landmarks, no sand. It was just a glass dome filled with clear liquid and a small white wooden house. The house was a perfect replica of the cabin we were standing in. The label underneath read, "The Home." A horrifying realisation blooms in my chest. This wasn't just a collection of souvenirs. This was a system, a trap. And the only way to get them back was to enter the system myself. If I touched Mark's globe, I would be sent to the desert. If I touched Leo's, I would be sent to the forest. But how would we all get back together? I looked at Toby, his small face streaked with tears, looking at me with absolute, unwavering trust. I couldn't lose them. I had already lost my sister because I was too afraid to face the reality of her fading. I would not let fear paralyse me again. "Toby, listen to me very carefully. I am going to touch the globe with your brother. Once I am gone, I want you to wait exactly 1 minute. Then, I want you to touch the cabin globe, the home. Do you understand?"
No, don't leave me, Mom. Please.
"It is the only way, Toby. If we are in the globes, we need an anchor to pull us back. The cabin globe is the anchor. If you touch it, you will come to the cabin. But maybe, just maybe, it will reset the whole thing. If it doesn't, we will be together. I promise you, I will not let us be separated." It was a desperate, illogical plan born of absolute panic, but it was all I had. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I reached out toward the black forest globe. My hand was shaking so violently I could barely aim my fingers. The glass looked cold. I could see the tiny blue figure of Leo inside, surrounded by those suffocating painted trees. 1 minute, Toby. Count to 60. I touched the glass. The world turned inside out. The sound of my own breath was replaced by a deafening, roaring wind. The scent of lemon wax vanished, replaced by the damp, metallic smell of wet earth and rotting pine needles. I wasn't standing in the cabin anymore. I was standing in a forest. But it was wrong. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks a matte, pitch-black colour that seemed to absorb the light. There was no sky above, only a smooth, curved grey ceiling that pulsed with a faint, artificial luminescence. The ground beneath my feet was soft and spongy, covered in a thick layer of white sediment that looked like snow, but felt dry and powdery, like crushed bone. "Leo!" I screamed, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the dense trees. The air was incredibly thick, making every breath a struggle. I began to run through the black trunks. The silence here was alive. It was a heavy, watching silence that pressed against my ears. In the distance, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of something moving through the dry, powdery snow. But the footsteps were wrong. They were too rhythmic, too mechanical. A scraping, dragging sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "Leo, where are you?" I burst into a small clearing. Standing in the centre was Leo. He was huddled against a black trunk, his knees pulled to his chest, his blue hoodie covered in the white powder. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and wild with terror.
Mom? How are you here? What is this place?
"I've got you, baby. I've got you." I ran to him, throwing my arms around his small, shivering frame. He felt real, but his skin was ice cold. Suddenly, the faint scratching sound in the forest grew louder. From the shadows of the black trees, things began to emerge. They were silhouettes, tall and impossibly thin, their limbs elongated and jointed in ways that defied human anatomy. They had no faces, only smooth, blank expanses of grey skin that reflected the artificial light of the dome above. They didn't walk, they glided over the bone-dry snow, their movements accompanied by a low, static hum that vibrated in my teeth. They were the caretakers of this miniature prison, and they had noticed our intrusion. "Leo, run!" We scrambled back, but the figures were faster, closing the circle around us. The air grew colder, freezing the breath in our throats. The static hum in my head grew to a deafening roar. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling Leo close to my chest, waiting for the end. Then, the sky broke. The curved grey ceiling above us shattered, with a sound like a cracking whip. The black trees began to vibrate, their trunks splintering into dark dust. The ground beneath us tilted violently. The figures of the caretakers froze, their smooth heads tilting toward the sky, as if listening to a distant signal. A sudden, blinding light flooded the forest, and I felt myself being pulled upward, weightless, dragging Leo with me through a vortex of roaring wind and white snow. We slammed onto the hard pine floor of the cabin. I gasped for air, coughing up a mouthful of the dry white powder. Beside me, Leo was gasping too, clutching my arm. I looked up. The living room was in ruins. The mahogany shelves had partially collapsed. Dozens of snow globes shattered on the floor, their glass shards glinting in the pale light of the television. Water and sand pooled on the floorboards. Standing by the collapsed shelf was Mark, wet and covered in yellow sand, his face a mask of disbelief. And beside him was Toby, his hand still resting on the shattered remains of the home globe. He had done it. He had touched the anchor and broken the cycle.
Laura, Leo, oh my God.
Mark rushed over, throwing his arms around us. We were all shaking, crying, holding on to each other in the wreckage of the living room. We were whole. We had survived. But as I hugged my family, my eyes drifted to the remaining shelves. Most of the globes had survived the fall, and in the silence of the cabin, I heard it. A faint, collective whispering. Hundreds of tiny, desperate voices, muffled by layers of glass and water, crying out from the shelves. I looked down at the floor near my hand. A single, unbroken globe lay in the pool of water. It was labelled, the cabin. But it was no longer empty. Inside the tiny glass dome, standing in the miniature living room of the wooden house, were 4 tiny figures. They were huddled together in the centre of the room, looking up at the sky. I looked up at the ceiling of the cabin we were standing in. For the first time, I noticed how perfectly smooth it was, how curved, and how, behind the rustic wooden beams, there was a faint, artificial hum, that sounded exactly like static. And so ends tonight's tale, Snow Globes. Thank you for sitting with us in the dark. If the shadows spoke to you tonight, subscribe to Spooken Softly and stay close. There are more stories waiting, more voices in the walls, more things that go quiet just before you notice them. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.